How's it going?
It's going. It's good.
Nice.
I spent a lot of time last week thinking I was making a video. In reality, I wasn't.
Explain.
Well, we have started to realize that, one of the hardest parts of like making consistent videos is the fact that you don't always actually know what you're going to make. And if you're like heads down in a project, you're going to have tons of ideas for explaining. If you're doing mentoring, you're going to have tons of ideas. But then sometimes we have weeks where we're focused on other things and we want to teach a specific topic that we've had in our mind for a while. I was going to work on a free video about this kind of like nested navigation drop-down thing. And so this is where like, it's just funny, just like we're bad at estimating doing software development. It's like hard to estimate how easy a demo is to make,
I mean, technically that does involve software development. So
Exactly. That's exactly why. So yeah, I wanted to make, a simple demo. Nested drop down seems like perfect kind of thing for Ember. I mean, it is. And then, but to explain it in a generic way, that's not just hacked together.
also just nested dropdowns have existed since like 2005. So you would think you would see that and think, oh, this is easy. It feels like a thing that's very, very easy to get the estimation wrong.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, doing this. So I found a cool example on Porsche's website. Porsche. George from Seinfeld says Porsche, so I think I'll say Porsche. There's a great example of this, and it's actually a cool example because it's like a nested drop down, but the submenus aren't the same, so they're not all the same component. They don't all look the same. Whereas normally you would think like if you were navigating like a settings menu on an iPhone or something like that, it's just like list items and they all look pretty the same. Maybe they have like an icon or something like that, but they're basically just text.
So it's like a list and then you hover over something and then another list gets rendered and you hover over something and there's like a third list that gets rendered.
Exactly. But in the case of Porsche's website, it's like you hover over models and then you hover over like 718 and then it shows you like a really nice. It's still a sub menu that you can hover over, but it looks completely different. So, since we've kind of been on this kick with these renderless components and just it's kind of what I've realized, like how my brain works now, how it approaches these problems where you see something like this, you start to build the thing. And this is how I will eventually make a video on this. It's going to be a free video. You will eventually, if I were coding this in an app, I would start by just coding the first thing statically, no components, just all in like, let's say application template or something like that. And you just code it and threw in like an Ember concurrency task there to make it so it doesn't like disappear as soon as you hover off it. You don't like punish the user for missing a pixel. So that's pretty cool. That was like really nice. And then when it comes to like abstracting it, because you kind of make all these menu items, right? And then you just see a bunch of like repetition. Every one of these menu items is like a list item and an anchor tag, and all of the classes are on anchor tags. And it's not just a styling, it's this functionality too, where like you hover over something and it mutates like the hovered state. And then if that hovered state matches the current menu item, like you render the sub menu item. And so you want to start abstracting it. And so, I think historically in a situation like this, I would just start grabbing pieces of this thing and pulling it out and putting it into components. But they would be like the chunks of the thing I'm building, like the actual menu.
Yeah. And I think that's correct. I think that makes for a bad video because you want to teach these higher level concepts.
It is correct in the sense that is the next step, but then very quickly you're going to have to build a child menu and you realize all these classes that you have for the top level don't match it. And so you're like, I know this is going to be horrible. What am I going to do here? Like, is second menu level equals true? And you have all this markup and stuff. And again, like just because our understanding on this stuff has developed, you just kind of think about it differently. And like, I look at a big messy template that has like CSS and markup, and it has like event handlers and like action handlers and stuff. And now I just see two different things.
Yeah, you see presentation and behavior.
Exactly. And so I think it's going to make an awesome video once we get a solution we're happy with, where you just abstract the behavior. And so what does that look like? Well, what is the behavior that's common across all those menus and submenus, regardless of the fact that they look so different? And it's basically this idea that, it's like something like, it's almost like a selectable list where you have a set of items, and then the menu that holds those items knows which one is being hovered or which one's active. And then that thing is itself an item, and it has a menu that has a set of items that knows what's being hovered or active. Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of data structure and behavior associated. It's like a data structure, and it updates based on some hover interactions. So that's kind of like the abstraction. And you can imagine that. Ryan Florence said this once a few years ago, where he was making like a tabs component in Ember, like way back in the day. And he was like, you want to think about doing this in a way that's like, if this were added to HTML, what would the API be? And it's like tabs, and it was like tab or something like that. And there's like a relationship between them somehow. Mm-hmm. And the kind of the same way like select and options has a relationship.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like list and list item.
Exactly. So if HTML had this out of the box, like drop-down list or hoverable list and like list.item, something like that, then you can imagine that. And it's basically just, so there's like a lot of interesting things here. So first, it's like you're using this list and list item menu thing, and it's like, well, these are probably going to be like links. They're going to be like anchor tags. That's how they were when I first coded the static template. So then it's like, do you make the item an anchor tag? And then it's like, you're already like mixing behavior and presentation in some sense. Because then you're like, well, what if I want to make this like a link to? Like, it shouldn't have, Ember developers know how to render link tos. Like, they should be able to use that if they want to.
Right. You wouldn't want them to like make a new class that extends link to and then register that with like your list item generator. Yeah.
And even if you had like a click helper or like an href2 thing that you could throw on like list.item, you still have to know list.item is an anchor tag. Like, it's just not composable as it could be. You can imagine this thing being renderless. And that's kind of the path I started going down, because then you're really abstracting it away from presentation, and you really have this abstract concept of a menu with many items that responds to being hovered and updates some state. It's pretty interesting though, because, well, we can get into it, but there's a lot of interesting things here. So like, first of all, if you're a renderless component, but the whole point of this component is to set some state when you hover it, what do you do there?
I think you would expose like an on hover action, because you don't want to render a component with an on hover.
I actually didn't think about that. That's not a bad idea.
You don't want to render a component with on hover, because now you're mixing this thing that could be presented with the on hover action.
Well, what if you just say, the contract for this list.item is whenever you hover my contents, this thing becomes like active, let's say.
But for you to hover my contents, I have to be an HTML node.
Maybe you just yield out your block, your child block.
But then I don't think you can get an on hover event if you yield out. Sorry. If you have tag name in your component,
tagless component, like a tag name of.
So if you have tag name empty string, then I don't think you can on hover that thing.
Not that thing, but you could as children. So I found this kind of hack.
Like any one of its children?
Well, that's the thing. So this is why this gets complicated. You can render siblings into a component. And so that's kind of like opens that question, which is one of the reasons why like all of those click and mouse over events are wired up for components that have a tag that are like, quote, well-behaved components. But again, like this renderless component pattern is really powerful. And we're trying to, I feel like we get so much mileage out of it that like, I'm trying to see how many places we can use it. Because if you had this drop-down list and list item pair, and it didn't prescribe anything about what it renders, and it's super powerful.
Yeah.
That could be an open source library that anyone could use anytime they need to do this. And then they make their own like EmberMap drop-down list that uses it, but then does the particular presentation, you know?
Yeah. And not only for drop-downs, but you can see this everywhere. Like you brought up tabs earlier.
Yep.
like autocomplete.
Yep.
This is kind of what Power Select it does. Power Select has a bunch of components that it exposes. I don't know if you can go full renderless with it, or at least I haven't.
Mm-hmm.
So I always use them as like kind of building blocks.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this would be so many UI patterns you can write like this.
Yes.
So it would be awesome if this was sort of like the Ember best practice, and there are well-trodden paths to go down.
Right.
Battle-tested add-ons, so on.
Right. Collapsible panel is another one. That's an add-on that we maintain. You know, I was just working on that, and there was someone who had added some accessibility stuff to it, which is great. It's exactly the kind of stuff you want in an add-on like that. Aria.
Aria attributes.
Yeah.
That's funny. I was talking to people on Twitter about that, and they said the first rule of Aria is don't use Aria.
Okay.
And I was like, all right, I know nothing about this.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if it was Aria attribute, like Aria role, whatever it was something about like the content. And it's like, that's great. Now, if I use Ember collapsible panel, then I never have to worry about this again. So that's an interesting question. If you had renderless, maybe there is something where I was just thinking like, what if dropdown list and list item, you want it to be an anchor tag. You always want it to be an anchor tag. And because you want to be able to click on it and like alt click on, like command click on it. And maybe that's actually part of the responsibility, like the opinionated version of this thing. But anyways, that's
to answer that,
yeah.
The path you're going down, I think you want to provide like a high level thing,
mm-hmm.
like your dropdown list provides an anchor tag
mm-hmm. component
that I can just render and it works 90% of the time.
Right.
But then it should also have escape hatch. Where it's like, okay, I can wire this up myself. And maybe like the lowest level of escape hatch is like, yeah, I have to like, you'll give me the Aria stuff or the accessibility attributes, but I have to figure out where to put them. Like,
right.
But again, that is like the
building blocks for the whole thing.
The escape hatch.
Totally. So, so there is, I found this actually relatively recent Stack Overflow answer, which I was pleasantly surprised to find when Googling how to get children from a tagless component reliably. And you basically dive into some private API, but it turns out that it's pretty heavily relied on by a lot of add-ons and could be public. It's one of those intimate APIs. So if you ever make something that relies on it, basically there's going to be like a path forward one day. And it's like Ember view bounds. It's like ember.view.get view bounds or something like that. And it's basically part of how Ember's like view model and therefore its component model tracks things and knows how to update things and knows what children are and parents are.
So this is a method on a component?
Yeah.
So I could call this and did insert element?
Something like that. You like do ember.viewutils.get bounds, get view bounds, and you pass in this. So then you get the view object. Like it's just the actual component class instance. And then it can tell you like,
what does it return? What's the signature?
It returns an object that has like first node as a property, last node as a property, and then something like children or something like that as a property. So you can kind of, I didn't dive into this much, but you can kind of intuit like what's going on where it needs to get Ember is building up a graph. The rendering engine is building up a graph of your component tree. And so that's basically what that is, right? And so in that way, you're able to get those children. And so you could do this in a renderless way, and you could actually do some validation. So when like list item renders, first you get the bounds and you get the block that was passed in by the consumer, validate that only one root node was passed in, then you can attach a hover event to that thing or enter a mouse leave.
That's pretty cool.
So that would be pretty awesome, because then you could do list menu.item, and then you can render like a link to. And now this is a link to, but also if you happen to hover it, you're going to mutate the state on the menu in the list. So I think that's pretty awesome.
Do you worry? So I just had this thought. Do you worry that it's like too magical? Magical is what people that complain about this stuff, that's a word they always use.
Yeah.
Do you feel that? Yeah. Do you feel that's too magical? Like you're grabbing the first node and attaching event handlers to it. Feels like there's no.
So this is the alternative is like, and I think a lot of this actually would be fixed if we were using Glimmer components, if Glimmer components become the thing, because this is the problem with the current Ember component model, is that the template is inner HTML instead of outer HTML. So the problem is, let's say you wanted to make a link that was an A tag, and now you want to compose well with things like link to and other things. Now you have this whole other, like, how do you change, how you could even do it so where you can change the tag name of the link. It's defaults to A, but you change it, and you do that by passing in tag name equals. Remember, we used to do that with Ember components all the time, because the whole idea with like attribute bindings and class bindings and tag name was like, you need to customize HTML. Here's how you do it on the Ember component model. And then we realized it's way better to just have one way to do that, since we already know how to do that, and that's using HTML. And like once handlebars became HTML aware, and you can do like curlies on attributes, just way better. So I think the idea of attaching the event handler to the child like that, I think it might be easier with the Glimmer component, since
I see.
The template is like inner HTML or outer HTML now. So anyways, for now, I think it would be okay if it was like, that's the contract. Like, what does this do? It's just like adding and removing an event listener to the root. So anyways, there's some stuff to figure out there, but that's not even a lot of the discussion we had, which was like, how do you even do this thing? So there's this idea of, there's a recursive idea here, because you have like a n level deep list of items, and of lists of items, right? Mm-hmm. So with one list with many items, let's say you have, A, B, C, D, and you hover A, and A is now the active item. So there's a couple things here. First, that when you render like list.item as item, you want to be able to do something like is item.isActive, if item.is active. And so you don't want to just say, if I've hovered it, like that is what you need, a separate abstraction there. So you have like, let's say you do this with data down actions up. You hover that first list item, it sends an action to the menu, and the menu sets the active item to this ID. And let's say they have IDs or indexes or something like that. And then that menu can pass down the active index to those 4 children. And so a child can say, have a computer property called isActive, saying, if my index is equal to the selected index or the active index.
The index that was passed into me.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. So that's like the data down actions up way to do it. And that works pretty well. And again, like having that is active as a yielded thing is so great to just do whatever you need to do there. You don't have to like, this is another thing I ran into. Let's say list.item is an A tag. How do you customize this? Even if you could pass in CSS classes, like class equals, how do you customize the class based on the active state of that item?
Active classes equals string.
That's exactly what link to does. Yeah.
And
what about inactive classes?
Inactive classes equals string.
Yeah. So what you want is you want to yield as is active, and then if is active, you can just compose it all with any attribute you want. You can do disabled, you can do anything, because it's awesome.
Yes.
Handlebar is awesome. So that's why you want that thing to be renderless, basically, and to yield that is active property. So that works pretty well. And then there's this thing that happens once you start doing the submenu. So with one list, it's easy to see how hovering the second item means that one is active. Now let's say you hover the second item and it pops open a submenu. So you have like menu as menu, menu.item, menu.item, menu.item. And you have menu.item as item. You render the contents, and then you do item.submenu. So you render item.submenu, and then submenu.item, submenu.item, submenu.item. So now you have like a nested thing.
Yep.
So if you think about the UI you're building here, like you're hovering over the thing and it's popping up, maybe you're doing some ifs or something like that. But when you hover from the root menu to the submenu, the root menu needs to stay alive.
Yep.
So if you're doing this kind of in a data down actions up way, if you went to the Porsche website, you hover over the three level deep of menu, all the parent menus are still alive. They're still active. And you can see which item is highlighted. So from a data modeling perspective, like that second item that you hovered first in the root menu is still active. Mm-hmm. So that's what got us to talking about this. What's the recursive idea here? And it's, how do you know if an item is active or not? If it's being hovered as active, or if it has a child submenu that has an active item. So if you do it with two menus, it makes sense, right? So you hover the first item, definitely active. Then you mouse over to the sub menu. So I'm hovering over submenu.item2, root menu.item1 is still active. But you can't just say if I'm hovering over this thing, because now you go to submenu 3. So now I'm not hovering over anything in the submenu 2, but this root item in 1 is still active.
Right.
But if you can say that this thing in submenu 2 is active because I'm hovering its child, then you get the recursion. So I'm active if I'm being hovered or if I have a child who's active. I'm active if I'm being hovered or if I have a child who's active, all the way down. So this is really cool. The problem is when you actually go to implement this, it turns out to be a little tricky. And this is because the part that says, are any of my children active? It's kind of like the opposite. It's like data up, because you're a parent that you're rendering a set of items and you need to introspect them.
But I think I don't know if I agree with that. So I didn't either until I started writing it.
I
think I don't think you want to look down. I think you want to look up. So why didn't you have this problem with one menu?
Because it wasn't recursive. It was just like the simple use case.
But with one menu, why didn't you have to say like, why didn't you have to know the children?
Because the parent passed down the active ID.
Yeah.
So if you look at the whole data structure like 4 levels deep, then the root could pass down like the 4 active items on each of those things.
Yes.
The problem is that that's just like very complicated, and
I think it's the only way.
So I have a question. If you think you shouldn't do data up, then what do you think about children.count in React? So in React, there's a thing called this.children, which gives you exactly what we're talking about, like the 4 siblings items that you're being passed in, and they have a count property. Yeah.
I mean, I've never used that, so I don't know. It's like a cop-out answer. I absolutely.
Let's say you have a menu and you just.
I absolutely think there are situations where you need to inspect your children. Like we talk about this, like building a table of contents.
Yes, exactly.
Like you need to know the titles of the H1s in all your children to build that table of contents.
Yeah, exactly. And so each one of those titles could like action up, I am a title with this thing, and the parent could build the data structure. But like, or what if the best data structure is just the actual tree of components, and those are stateful components and they have their state?
So this is more, it's easier to swallow this with the table of contents because you do have an awesome data structure that's HTML.
Okay, so what about your component hierarchy in a nested tree of subnavs? You already have the data structure you want is the component tree. So if you were to reproduce that component tree, like really the whole data structure is like these 4 items and this one's active, these 3 items and this one's active, right? So if you were to recreate that in like an object and arrays at the root and pass it down and render, that would be ridiculous. That would be like very...
No. Yeah, if you were going to do an OO way of this, you would say like I'm active if I have an active leaf node.
Yeah, exactly.
Or...
So that's what I want. I want to write that on an item, and I don't want to have to conceptualize the full data structure since you already basically have it.
You don't need to conceptualize the full data structure. I think you can do it with again, why was it easy with one?
Well, because there was no recursion.
But it was data action up, data down.
Yeah, but when you hover the second menu, the submenu, now this is a problem. You're hovering like the 5th submenu, and you have to tell like the root of the whole tree about it.
No, you only tell your parent about it.
No, but that's no, because I need to know in the root of the tree, I need to know if any of my children are active.
No, you only tell the parent, and then every parent tells its parent. But from the point of view of a component, you're only telling your parent, and that makes it up the tree. But the component that's n levels, 5 levels down, is not communicating with the root.
Okay,
he's telling his parent, "Hey, I'm active," and then that parent can think of every level as just the one the one case. So that parent can set like my active thing, And then it can also action up to its parent that it's active. So then its parent.
It's still data up, but that's
it's actions up. You're firing an action. I mean, yeah, you're passing data in that action, but you're firing an action that's saying like
you hover on the fifth level, and that could pass an action. But then the fourth level item is going to have is active computed property that's going to flip, and the third level item is going to have a computed property that's watching that fourth level.
No, I'm saying the opposite way. So
you hover a fifth.
You hover the fifth. You
shoot up to the menu. Says is hovered true.
Is hovered true.
ID 1 2 3.
ID is hovered true. Number 4 sets like my active item is the component that just moused up that just fired this action over to me.
I see.
That data flows back down to 4, and 4 says, hey, sorry, that data flows back down to 5, and 5 says, hey, I'm active because 4 just set active child. So that gets 4 highlighted. Now you keep doing that all the way up the tree. So then 4,
it's kind of weird,
sends a message up to 3 that says,
so a menu has an action. So a menu has an action that's not actually did hover. It's like did become active, or like child did become active, or something like that.
Yeah.
Or item was
selected. Set item active. Was set. I mean, set.
But this is where,
item.
This is kind of where I want. Like the way we're talking about it though is kind of different from like if you were to just look at that Porsche website, you would say, yeah, item 2 in the root menu is active if it's hovered or if any of its children are active. I just want to do like this dot items dot filter by is active greater than 0.
Yeah, I agree with this. I wonder if there's like a term for this where like the data structure is not how your brain would conceptualize it, and I wonder if that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are algorithms and data structures that are like they're like mind bendy.
Right.
It's like, oh wow, that's so clever, but it's not how you think about the thing.
Right.
But yeah, I do think that the data down actions up is
possible.
It's like it's one direction. So and it's just the recursive is you just have
the
one.
The problem
menu.
is there's only one action, and then everything else is derived from that. So the action is hovering. Like menu number 3 now having an active thing is derived from the fact that you hovered the item in 5. It's not an action. It's not really an action.
It is an action.
It's not an action. The action is hover. The handler is what sets state on like root menu 4, and then everything else should be derived from that. Like everything is derived from that. Like if you handled every hover action in the root parent, you would just have one little thing that's like set active node to ID 1 2 3, and then everything's derived property would be am I active?
Yeah, it is 1
either
2, 3
I'm
children,
1 2 3 or 1 2 3 is one of my children.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that's why I want it all to be like derived properties. But it's dude, in like Ember, like computer properties on component instances are like super useful and easy. So like that's what I want. I want like I don't want a separate data structure for my state bucket here. My component tree is a perfect state bucket.
I don't think you need a separate state bucket.
Yeah.
I think Booleans, each component has Booleans or have a hover the child that is active property that gets set by an action that they pass down.
Yeah.
But I do. It is weird, and I think just to acknowledge what you're saying, I do think this is a really hard problem because if you're going to solve this in OO, that it's exactly what we've been saying. I'm hovered if I'm the active or child's active.
Right.
So yeah,
that's like the most natural way to express a problem. I'm really curious about this.children in React. I want to play around with it and see, can you get state from the children? I think that's like an anti-pattern. If I was like doing like this.children, like let's just say, I want to know which one of my children has an is blue property of true. So like this.children that like filter by is like has a props dot is blue. Can you do that? That seems on the one hand, like the data down actions up thing is like, no, you should be like data should flow from the root down. But on the other hand, it's like, this.children.count. That is data up.
Yeah.
And it's not data down actions up makes sense because you don't want data up in the sense of like if you have a property on the parent that's derived from its children, I think that makes sense. I don't think that there's something wrong with that architecturally.
I agree, because there's tons of data structures that do this.
Yeah.
So it seems weird that
Comments count or something like that.
Yeah, it seems
apparent.
It seems, yeah, exactly.
Array.length or whatever, basically. But it's definitely not data down actions up. Like, it's kind of weird. So we've had this. So
why? Wait, let's.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with this, but let's see if we can unpack this. So why, if I want to know the count of comments that a post has, I can just find all the posts with this, find all the comments with this post ID. So it's array.length.
Yeah.
Why? That's just what everyone does today.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't people do something where, like, when I create a new comment, I find the post and I increment its comments count by 1? Because that's kind of what this data down actions up thing is.
Would say to do.
I would say, like, you shouldn't do that, because it's really easy to get out of sync.
Right.
It's really easy for that number to be 5 when there's only 4 posts, 4 comments. So I wonder if there's some benefit to this, something that we're missing, that this is why data down actions up is good.
Right. Maybe it's also just a special case and it's harder. So, like, one of the things that we were talking about along with this when I was coding this, because this has come up, like, this comes up a couple times a year, but I really want to find a good solution to this. And it's the table content situation. There's a few more situations. It's basically where a parent's rendering actually does depend on his children. So again, we think normally of having data in some form, either in like model layer or POJOs or whatever at the root, in that your rendering is a pure function of state. And so the state is known ahead of time at the beginning, and then you render from that state. But what if your rendering is a function of the children? What if the actual rendering of the children affects the state of the parent?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, your state is HTML.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just your state is in the parent state is in the children, and it's actually derived from the children. And so, yeah, let's just.
Okay, so just wild idea. You render, you get HTML, and then you have like a reactive thing that says, oh, you have like a mutation observer.
Yeah.
That says like new HTML on the page.
Yeah.
And that
update state at the root.
Update state with new HTML at the page. And now you get this.
You can definitely get a cycle. Let's say, like, you have a component that renders a child, and once the child did insert elements, it, like, on the next tick or like in a second, it does send out some action, and then the parent's like, every time that action happens, I render again. And so I can just keep rendering and like append a child, render, append a child, render.
But that'd be good. I mean, that's what we want.
Yeah,
right?
That's what you want to be able to describe that. You want to be able to build that. So
so I think you want something that's like a mutation observer that says HTML changed, a function that takes HTML and maps it to state.
But this is
and
where
state changes.
But this is where, like, how does children work in React? Where do you already have that? You get the data structure, basically. If you were to iterate over something and render a bunch of children, can the parent then say, oh yeah, that's that children that count, or something like that? So yeah, it's an interesting problem. But in Ember, you'll hit this error often when I try to do stuff like this, where it says you try to modify the view twice in a single render. This has been deprecated due to being a performance issue. So don't do that. And so that's exactly like dynamic table contents. The table contents state depends on the page being rendered, because only then do you know what the actual data is. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think it would be good to try to express this problem in a simple way. I actually did, and I think with did insert element, like, the child can fire something on did insert element, and the parent can respond and like increment a counter and like render this component has this many children, and it can work without that error. But if the parent then has, let's say, that counter, and it says there's 5 children, but it wants to pass that counter down to the children, and let's say the children has a computed property that says parent.counter greater than me or something like that, or whatever, and tries to render it itself, I think that's where you hit the error. So that's the trick. That's the part that's hard. And you can see how that comes back to the subnab we were talking about. Mm-hmm. You really want this data structure to be easily accessible and traversable. Like, you want a menu.items, and then like an item wants to be able to say, oh, let me grab my parent.items and see which one's active and if I'm in it, or something like that, right? If I'm a child of it or whatever, you should be able to do that. So interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to getting to like a good spot with that, because I think it'll be a fun one to make, and it'll just be like a pattern that we'll be able to use in other areas too.
Yeah, I feel like the first few components like this that we make are going to be the hardest.
Yes.
And you see the pattern, you learn all the rough edges, and yeah, I'm super excited for these.
Yeah, totally. Cool. So we just published. Actually, we didn't publish it yet, did we? Maybe by the time you're listening to this, we just published it.
Podcast-driven development.
Right. We just published angle bracket component video. So one of the free videos we have coming out this week is on an angle bracket component, which was fun to make. And it's on an aspect ratio, as a fixed aspect ratio. So in EmberMap, we render a bunch of images throughout the site. And there's this nice CSS that we get to use that sets aside enough space for an image or a video. So if you know that your image is in a 16:9 aspect ratio, you can do some CSS, some trickery with some padding bottom to set the space aside, so while that image loads, your whole page doesn't like folk.
The first time I ever saw that, it's like padding bottom
56.25% or whatever.
Yeah, and I was just like, what is this? Like what? Like who? And then what is it? It's like 16 divided by 9.
Yeah, exactly. 9 divided by 16. Yeah, exactly.
16 divided. Yeah, yes.
56%.
Yes,
yeah. 16.9, 9 divided by 16. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So and it was funny because like I was just looking at EmberMap's code base, because a good way to find like a content for videos is just like look at our code, and like since the app is like 2 years old, there's just like a bunch of old patterns, and it's just because this is a normal app that has that. There's like a bunch of patterns, and like it is pretty cool to reflect back and like think about our understanding here, because like this was just tachyons we used to use, and it shows has some aspect ratio classes in it, and that let you do this. You have to have like a div with like an AR-16:9, and then you have like one child div that has like AR-content, and then you can put your image in there. And there's like classes for it, and like we have these classes all over our app, and it's just like implementation detail leaking all over the place. Like
totally. And doing this like code. Was it when you like dig for dinosaurs? Archaeology. Doing like this, like looking at a code base that's 2 years old.
Yes.
A lot of times when I'm implementing like these 16:9 images, I just do a project find for 16.
Yes.
And then I find it and I just copy and paste
I guess that's what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. And so that's why there's like, and then I need to like change it. And so that's why you get these like weird mutations all over the app.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good to like look back at that, see how it was used,
right?
And come up with like this component. Well, I guess you should talk about what you came up with.
Right. So the answer is to turn this into a component. But like, no, I think what you're saying is really good. And it's about, we always say this and we don't always practice it, but we try to, where, you duplicate something 3 or 4 times before trying to abstract it. And like, dude, once you have that, it's so much easier to get a great abstraction than if you're on my second time and I'm going to just jump for something like with the submenu stuff.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
This was like crystal clear. Also, I did it. It's actually in the video too, and it kind of once I use it again, there's a kind of a little bit of an unexpected thing. But because we have those 4 or 5 use cases, I can make sure the abstraction is refined enough so it's not going to be surprising, and like we can just make it clear. So it's really good to have those multiple use cases before jumping to abstractions. So yeah, basically it's just 2 divs and a bunch of class and some CSS, and it's like perfect thing to use for a component. And you know what I noticed when I was doing this, like doing the prep for this, I did it as like curlies, because our code base is like 2.18 right now or something like that, and it's curlies, and like we're going to upgrade it, probably make a video about it and start using angle brackets. But just whatever, we're using curlies right now. A lot of people are using curlies, and there's something about it. It really actually does. I think the angle bracket components are going to change a lot of the kinds of components that we write, or at least they'll open the door for new components that we wouldn't have previously wanted to turn into a component. It feels more lightweight. So I did it as curly angle, like curly hashtag aspect dash ratio space ratio equals 16:9, render the contents, and it feels heavy. It just looks, the template looks confusing because it's like I have these business components, but then I have this thing, and it's really hard to differentiate. Like I like that HTML, you can kind of ignore it because it's like, I know this is like not an implementation detail as opposed to my component. Something about the angle brackets makes it feel a lot more lightweight.
Is that how you see us using angle bracket components, where it's like they're smaller, like if HTML had this, it would be this?
That's not a bad idea. And like still using curlies for like the business stuff.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea. I think overall I think it's just more readable, and it just makes it feel like less control flowy. I think we'll probably use angle brackets everywhere.
Okay.
But the other thing is you can use single word components too. So like,
I mean, that's
going to be awesome. It's going to be huge.
No more. What do I put in front of this button?
Yeah, exactly.
X dash button,
yeah,
UI dash button.
Yeah, Acme. So yeah, so the component is aspect ratio, and it takes a single property, an argument ratio, and basically the parent has position relative and a padding bottom that's calculated. So in the 16 by 9 case, it's 56.25% on the bottom, and then the immediate child of that has to be a position absolute pinned to all sides, top, bottom, left, and right of 0 with 100%, height of 100%. That's how the kind of CSS hack works. And so the component encapsulates all that. And instead of having these global kind of like AR-16x9 classes, AR-34-x13 class, which is like what we use for like the featured images. And if you wanted it at 4.3, you'd have to go define a new CSS class in this global file. Now we just calculate it from the parameter that's passed in.
That's really cool.
It's really neat. And the other really cool thing is with the angle brackets is like the argument is an at sign. So you have like aspect ratio and then at ratio equals. It kind of looks like an instance variable in Ruby, which is really, it looks right because it's not an HTML attribute, because these things look like HTML tags now, but this is like at ratio equal. It's actually really pleasant. It's like a small thing, but it really makes a difference.
No, I was going to say there's something about that when you like write code and it's just clear. You're like, yeah, I could just do this other way and it's not that much different. But when you look at it, you're like, this is so much better. There's something there.
Yeah, and you look at the component right below it, and it's like some component, maybe it's like a UI thing or something, and it has like class equals, and then it has like user equals model, and you're like, these are all just like the same things. But now I know instance like data that's passing back and forth versus like HTML attributes. It's just really nice. Yeah, so that's the component. It's basically 2 divs and a single computer property. And by the end of the video, I've replaced, a lot of the images. Oh, also like we had this UI image component that took an AR property, and you can like pass an AR-16x9, and then like you look at the implementation of UI image, and it's like if AR, do all this extra stuff, and it's just like, yeah, it's so nice to have a single component to do that.
But by the way, next up, image component.
Yeah,
that needs some help.
Yep, that'll be a good one to do. That'll be a really good one to do.
Image components are tricky because it's not just an image tag. You can render a div with a background,
right?
And so this one, I always find these components tricky. Like conceptually, it's easy.
Yes,
but then in practice, there's 100 ways to.
Yes,
there's like 3 ways to render an image.
Yep, and the helper is a key part of this too, because you need to be able to use a helper in a few places. And we went through this a lot in the beginning, and like there might even still be places in the code base that's not using the right thing. But once we figured it out, it made sense. Like especially if you have your assets on a CDN and you want those to work, and you want local assets to work when you're developing, and you still want to be able to serve up assets from like your public directory that aren't on like a CMS or something like that aren't coming from a database. So it's like, it's kind of confusing to work through that. So that would be a really good video.
Nice.
For sure. But aspect ratio is like, I think with the angle brackets, we're going to see more of these kinds of things come up. Lower level stuff you see kind of in the React community more, just like really simple one-off. They have like box and flex, things like that. And it's like you could see that, like a flex component that just renders a div with like flex.
Interesting. So why?
I mean, I don't think we should jump to that right now, but I'm just saying like there's something that about it feeling lightweight instead of like, would you do like an X flex X items
No,
center.
there's too much overhead,
too much ceremony,
and it's too much ceremony, and it's hard to edit.
Yeah,
just with like the class name bindings.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
just too hard to edit right now.
Exactly.
Do you? What is the benefit of a Flex component versus div class Flex?
Feels like we're starting a new episode of a podcast here. No, so that's like the main API. I think it's from like styled components or something like that. And it's just, it's trying to get these layout primitives. So you're looking at a UI and you're thinking about how to lay it out. And you can use div class flex, but if every time you do that, you use div class flex, why not just use a flex component that does that for you? It's like a little bit higher level, a little bit abstracted away. I think that stuff's hard to get right. I would be interested to see what it actually looks like in practice when you use that stuff. And I think it might just be like the root display properties that they have components for, but then you still end up passing in like basically inline styles in some data structure. So
I guess it's true if Flex doesn't need like any presentation stuff,
right,
and you can define a bunch of like an interface for like item center and align, all that stuff. It might be cool.
Yeah, totally. I also I would love to see one day I do believe that there is an abstraction that exists that's layout components, like using constraints and stuff that could work and like could get rid of a lot of the details, but like it's just so hard to get that stuff right. So, it's funny. Who was I talking? Oh, I had a conversation about Tailwind with someone on Discord, a couple people, and they were saying, this one guy was saying, what was his comment? He was saying, I don't really see the benefit over kind of like good practices and conventions if we just make CSS that's maintainable. And so we talked about that a little bit, and where we ended up was like, one of my things was like, what does good CSS practices look like? What do they actually look like? What are good, and variables too. I don't have a lot of experience with CSS variables. I want to try them out, but the idea that Tailwind is not, I think some people have an idea that Tailwind is like, not like Bootstrap, but it's confusing, right? Because Tailwind is like both like a subset of CSS, and it's also like an API for how you apply styles.
Yep.
And so you could just use you could be restrained in how you write classes. And instead of like, if you were writing like a SAS file and you could do like color blue, you can just go to town, but you can just say only colors you can use are from this module that you can import.
Yeah. $sign blue.
Exactly. So in that way you can restrain yourself, right? So you can restrain yourself to a subset of CSS if you just use variables. There's that aspect of Tailwind. The other aspect is the fact that it's actually also an API for styling, which is that it is a set of names that has been pre-decided for us, and the way you get a background color onto an element is to do background dash the name of that color, and that's it. There's no bike shedding. You don't have to decide that. That is the Tailwind convention.
There's no profile __.
So that's the thing. So the other way is like, right, you could constrain yourself to a certain kind of blue, but then you still have this naming thing. You still have to assign a name somehow. Semantic name, some people will say, or something like that. And that is another benefit of Tailwind from our perspective. That's something that it gets you, that you don't have to make those decisions at all. You can grow into those. That's right. And I was talking with Chris Kryko, jumped into, and he was talking about their kind of component first approach. And I was saying Tailwind, you can do like component last, like where once it makes sense to abstract a component, you can. But actually it encourages you to do that last because it helps you avoid so much of this naming stuff. There's a thing here too where, go ahead.
I just want to talk about like good CSS and best practices. I think what's not Adam Waltham, Adam...
at Murmurs.
Yeah.
Morse or Adam, something like that.
Yeah. Tachyon's creator.
Yeah, Tachyon's creator.
He's a great blog post where it's like, what is good CSS? And he just looks at a bunch of websites and analyzes production CSS. Yeah, and it's like one of them has like 20 something classes that all they have is display none.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we can talk about like the best way to write CSS, but in the reality, if the best sites in the world are still like not following this perfect CSS, it means it's really hard. It means there's like a real problem here.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that maybe people have a system that they're happy with and they feel they don't have a need for Tailwind, and they've come to a point where their process makes it so that they name things in a consistent and predictable way. The problem is that they are doing that themselves, and the fact that people can stray from that path easily, to me, points to the need for an abstraction. So in the same way that like with like a SQL database, you can write anything you want. You can call any column you want anything. When you use Rails, the ID column is called ID. And so it's built into the abstraction.
Is this something that like the benefits, like the more people you work with, the more people in your system, seems like it would be beneficial?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So anyways, like regardless of Tailwind, and also like, I don't want to get into this now because the podcast is almost over, but for me, Tailwind is a stepping stone to something else. It's not the end all. And a lot of people, I think, also maybe like see some of the work we do and they're like, Tailwind is super messy. Like there's problems it solves and then there's problems it creates. I think there's the important point is this stuff. Like it is abstracting away a lot of the decisions and the problem space that exists when you just go into a code base and have no abstraction. You're just writing CSS. It's too low level, too unconstrained.
I mean, bold statement, but yeah, I think the problems that it creates are way easier to deal with when you're writing a component-driven UI.
Yes.
And so for me, that trade-off is...
Yeah. There's still part of me that's like, the biggest reaction people have is like the messy templates. And it's not something that I don't want to dismiss it. It is a problem. It's like, it complicates how easy it is for you to understand a given template. But I think the next step would be like seriously just collapse the style attribute, because they're just separate concerns. And when you're doing one, you're not doing the other.
Class attribute.
The class attribute. Yeah, exactly. And then the next step would be like the visual designer sketch kind of thing, because like, you just think about it. This was another interesting thought I had when we were having this discussion around people who like to use semantic names for their classes. First of all, like just look at Twitter's profile. It's going to be crazy names that it's just hard to do that. It's just a lot of work.
We've all been there. It's profile __ info __ text
or a number or something like
dash name.
Yeah, it's really hard.
It's
a lot of. I don't want to say it's hard because that people will say like it's your job to learn it. It's not that it's hard. It's that there's no process. It's not abstracting away. It's pushing all the nitty gritty details onto every single developer that wants to style it. If you watch it, I had a thought of a way to counter argument this would be watch a designer design something and watch how they use name symbols and name styles in Sketch. And the answer is they're not going to start by naming things. They're going to end by naming things. So they're going to build that Twitter UI, and then they're going to start to notice some themes and make symbols and extract symbols, but they're going to have like 12 symbols in a file for a whole page. They're not going to have symbol for every single piece.
Dude, that's awesome. And they're also not going to create a symbol when they want to change the text color to red.
Exactly.
They're just going to go over and select red.
Exactly. And they have a palette, so they're going to define their 6 colors that they're using, and maybe they're going to define some spacing scales and stuff like that. But this rectangle in this part of the UI component is not going to have a name.
Put that in like the nugget. Nice little nugget bank.
Yep.
That's a really good one.
Nice one to have in the back pocket. So I think if that's how designers, even professional designers, work, then I don't think programmers should be expected to work differently. Like your mental model for designing the presentation and building the presentation layer should be the same. So
nice. Yeah. Really good.
So one day we will have a tool that does this and enforces it, and there's no more talking about should we name this thing __ avatar. So I do believe in that day.
We'll use machine learning to write all our BEM classes.
Exactly. We could that could be our next open source project. Predictive BEM class naming for you and your team. and the bike shed.
We've raised 70 million.
You have like a profile, and it's just like big red barn dash window _ front door, and it's like, that doesn't make sense, but like it doesn't matter because I didn't have to do it. It's a predictive algorithm.
It just adds -- info -- text to everything.
Yeah, that basically worked. Awesome. Let's wrap it up there. If you like our podcast, if anyone out there is listening at all, go let us know on iTunes. We'd love a review. We have some reviews and 5-star ratings there, which is pretty fun, pretty exciting. It's always good to hear feedback from folks who listen to the show. So yeah, we appreciate that. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.